and welcome to PCI DSS version 4.0 updates with Elizabeth Terry of the PCI Security Standards Council. I'm your host today, Donna Perkins with Conexxus, and our moderator today is Don Emery with CHS. Now I need to cover just a couple of agenda and housekeeping items. First, we'll talk a little bit about Conexxus, and then I'll introduce the presenters, and then Elizabeth will do the presentation. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available on Conexxus365.org within about a week. We do allow questions through the GoToWebinar interface. It's on the right-hand side of your screen, and if you just click the little questions bar, it should show up and you can enter your questions there. Please don't ask any vendor-specific questions, but go ahead and get your questions in early so that Dawn can field them for Elizabeth. Our webinars may be used toward PCI continuing education credits. Please contact 365 at conexxus.org for questions regarding a certificate for qualifying events. And here's our disclaimer that our lawyers like for us to add in. Conexxus does not endorse any products or services that may be described or mentioned in this presentation, and the views and opinions expressed in this presentation are solely those of the speakers and not of Conexxus. And thank you to our 2022 Diamond sponsors. We're very grateful to all of our sponsors for helping us produce these great webinars and provide educational content for our industry. If you're not familiar with Conexxus, we are an independent, nonprofit, member-driven technology organization. We set standards for data exchange, data security, mobile commerce, loyalty, point-of-sale back office, and more. We provide vision by identifying emerging tech trends, and we advocate for our industry on a technical level at other organizations to help steer the conversation around standards and policies so that changes don't negatively impact your organization. And of course, you can find us in several places. You can find us at Conexxus365.org. You can find us at Conexxus.org, and you can always find us on LinkedIn. All right, I'm going to hand this over to Don Emery, our moderator, so he can introduce Elizabeth.
Well, thanks, Donna. Well, I get the pleasure of introducing today Elizabeth Terry. Elizabeth is Senior Manager, Community Engagement for the PCI Security Standards Council. Her roles include responsibilities ensuring PCI SSC program participants are receiving the highest value within the programs and timely information and education about PCI standards and programs, as well as developing strategic community engagement efforts globally. Elizabeth currently chairs the Petro Task Force and was previously the chair for several special interest groups, the Mobile Working Group, and Task Force. She has been with the council for over a decade with over 25 years experience in the payment card industry and information security. Elizabeth holds a master's in business administration and bachelor's in computer science, and is a current PMP, CISSP, CIPP-US, CBSA, and PCIP. So Elizabeth, I'm going to turn it over to you and give us some updates on PCI SSC and 4.0 version.
Excellent. Thank you, Don. Appreciate that very much. So I'm really happy to be here to talk to everyone about PCI DSS 4.0 updates. And we will just get right into this. So as everyone is probably aware, PCI DSS 4.0 is live. It has been published. So both the standard, all of the reporting on compliance templates, the AOCs, as well as the SAQs have been published to our document library. So if you have not had a chance to go out and take a look at that, you should definitely do that, get a hold of those documents and start reading them, start learning them. And we'll talk more about what has changed in a moment. One of the other things that I wanted to mention is that we also include a summary of changes. So this is something that is going to give you a high-level overview, a high-level summary and description of the changes from PCI DSS 3.2.1 to version 4.0, but it doesn't contain all of the detail and all of the document revision. So due to the extent of the changes to PCI DSS 4.0, as you are probably well aware, the standard should be reviewed in its entirety rather than just solely focusing on the summary of changes, because you might miss something because there's so many changes there. And then an update was recently published. So if you downloaded this summary of changes when it was first published on March 31st, go back in and download the latest revision, because there were some updates to that as well. So self-assessment questionnaires, which most petroleum merchants are familiar with and have to complete, were also updated and published. And if you previously completed an SAQ, you need to find that new one, read it, understand the new requirements and the changes within that SAQ, because there were a lot of different updates because of the updates to the standard itself. Talk to your acquirer, your payment processor, or your petroleum brand to ensure that the one that you filled out before is still going to be applicable under DSS 4.0, because there were updates. You may be eligible for a different SAQ at this point. So let's jump in and talk a little bit more about what some of the goals were for DSS 4. So we wanted to ensure that the standard continued to meet the needs of the payment industry and the security needs of the payment industry, because things have changed so much since the original version 3 was published, and then 3.1, then 3.2, and of course 3.2.1. So the other thing too was adding flexibility to support all the different methodologies and all the different technologies that are being used to achieve security now. And then promoting security as a continuous process, as well as enhancing all the validation methods in the procedures. So first and foremost, just a little context. So before we go into the different changes, we wanted to provide a little insight into what happened with the development of the standard. So in the past, we had a 3-year cycle. So every 3 years, we would do a major update to the standard. And this took a little bit longer, as you are probably well aware. It took about 4 years to do, but here's why. We wanted to make sure that we were listening to the industry and getting that feedback and implementing the feedback and making changes that made sense. So we did 3 different RFCs. In the past, we've only done 1. So the first one that went out in 2019, we received over 3,000 comments from 153 different companies. We did another one in 2020. We had about half of those, the feedback comments that we had. And then finally, the one that we did last year was on the validation documents. We've never done that. The report on compliance, the SAQs, the AOCs, all of those went out for comment. And there was a lot of really good feedback with that. So in all of the RFCs, we had 6,000 plus pieces of feedback. What does that mean? That means that we had to look at each individual piece of feedback, and we did that. Each and every one of them, whether it took 2 seconds or 2 hours or 2 days to review that and understand what that impact might be and whether or not that was something we wanted to be able to implement and bring to the industry. So that's just a kind of an idea of how that was done. So you can see in the revision the result of that collaboration and listening to the industry. And we wanted to make sure that the community had the opportunity and many opportunities to be able to contribute to the new standard. So first and foremost, there's still 12 requirements. They remain. But what we did do is we made some updates to the wording of those different requirements. I'm going to highlight a few of those for you that might be pertinent. So you want to make sure that you go back and you read them specifically, because if you've got them memorized, which a lot of us do, some of that wording has changed, and we want to make sure everybody understands what's happening there. So in requirement 1, we wanted to update the firewall terminology to network security controls, because that supported a broader range of technologies that are used to meet security objectives that would be traditionally met by those firewalls, be it hardware or software. And then in requirement 2, that wording was also broadened a little bit because it always covered more than just the vendor defaults, vendor supplied defaults. So now it says it covers the secure configurations in general. And another thing was requirement 3. So we broadened that wording to say protect stored account data and not just cardholder data, which needs to be protected, because as the technologies evolve and as the payment methods evolve, we're getting more and more away from the actual physical cards. And so we wanted to reflect that in the standard. So requirement 4 had just had some minor wording to reflect the focus on strong cryptography. And requirement 5 was updated to clarify it was system and networks, and you're going to see that in a couple of the requirements, just to make sure that we were inclusive there, and because systems and networks need to be protected from malicious software and malware. Now, requirement 6, which was always about the payment software or software that's being developed for payments, was updated to emphasize software in itself rather than an application, because these days when you say an application, everybody automatically assumes an app on a phone, which may not necessarily be the case. It may be something else. So requirement 7, that was updated to include both system components and cardholder data. Again, just expanding that and making sure we're being more inclusive of what's happening. Requirement 10, we updated to logs rather than track to include system components. And then again, you'll see here in requirement 11, systems and networks. So be sure to test the security of those systems and networks regularly. And then requirement 12 was updated to emphasize the overarching goal of policies and procedures generally. And so requirement 12 is also where you're going to find updates to the third-party processor or service provider only requirements. So if you have looked at the new standard, you'll see that the format itself changed, and we've added a lot of new guidance in there. So we're going to highlight some of the guidance that we've added. So for instance, the applicability section was updated because PCI DSS requirements, some of them may apply to entities that do not store, transmit, or process data, the PAN. We've also clarified some terms around account data, CHD, which is your cardholder data, SAD, your sensitive authentication data, and PAN, because they're not interchangeable. We were very, very intentional of the words that we use, meaning when we say PAN, we mean that personal account number, we mean that card number, and not all the account data, not the CVV, not the expiration date, or any of the others. So the other thing too, because we released the software security framework, we wanted to update the section that talked about our PCI DSS and our software standards. So we rewrote that section to make sure that it covered all PCI software standards. And then we also added a new Appendix F to discuss the role of those software standards in helping to address the elements in Requirement 6. And then many of you may know, and you may not know, our existing payment application data security standard, PADSS, is going to be retired. It's the first standard we've ever retired, and that'll be retired in October of this year. And so we wanted to mention that in the DSS, that it is going to be retired and what that might mean to someone. So the other things that we did is it added a diagram to the scope of PCI DSS section under understanding PCI DSS scoping, because scoping is a huge thing. You have to know the scope of all of the data, all of your CDE, and how much that assessment is going to cover in order to make sure that you are doing the full assessment. And so that's been adapted. Third-party service provider, there's a lot of new guidance that's in the requirements themselves. And a lot of that is from some existing frequently asked questions that were created in the meantime. And so we've incorporated a lot of that into the guidance to clarify those third-party relationships. And I do encourage you to read that, because I know, from the petroleum industry perspective, you may have a lot of different service providers you deal with, your acquirer, your MNSP, your EPS POS system provider, the petroleum brand themselves. So you need to make sure you've read that, because there's a lot of really good guidance in there. Now, one of the things that we've heard, and we have gotten asked this question so many times in so many different formats, what does daily mean? What does quarterly mean? What does annually mean? What does this mean as far as timeframes are concerned? And that was a lot of the feedback we got in the RFCs as well. And this is a perfect example, because we included a description of those timeframes. There is a nice little diagram that tells you exactly what those frequencies and timeframes are, what they mean, and how they apply specifically to those requirements and what the expectation is. So that was something that we've added. And then we introduced a section into the requirements themselves to introduce the customized approach, which is something I'll talk a little bit about in a moment, and adding new appendices D and E to provide more details about that. So in the diagram that you see on your screen now, you can see on this slide, so we replaced a lot of the content on the first page of the detailed requirements and testing procedures. And then right before the actual requirements and testing procedures start, you'll see the graphic, and it explains all the different parts, why, where they are, and what they mean. We did reformat that guidance column included with each requirement, adding headers to clarify, what the content is. We added some guidance, which was more about how or which entity that particular requirement might apply to. That was moved into a different section, as you can see there on the lower right. I'm sorry, my other right, the lower left, the applicability notes. And then we took the PCI DSS glossary, which was a separate document, and incorporated that into the standard itself, and that's Appendix G. And while that blew the standard up as far as size was concerned, this allows you to have everything you need right there in front of you instead of having to go back and forth between documents. So we were often asked how PCI DSS, and we're still asked this question, how PCI DSS supports new emerging technologies and payments. And so one of the things is we always try to remain technology neutral with PCI DSS. And the requirements were intended to apply to all different types of environments, even if a type of technology wasn't specifically, called out in the standard, but the intent of the requirements is still applicable. So in version 4.0, we refocused the requirements and added objective statements to better emphasize its broader applicability to technologies of all different types. So in addition, we added that customized approach for most requirements, which specifically provides the entities that have implemented strong risk assessment and risk management practices a lot more flexibility if they're using different ways to meet those requirements. And they define the objective using those different technologies and processes. So that's some additional flexibility that we added there. And having said that, we wanted to add more emphasis on cloud, because from PCI DSS 3.0 to now, there's a big span, and cloud wasn't really a thing when that was originally published. So we wanted to make sure that the scope of the requirements where numerous system components are called out. We reworked Appendix A1 so that it can be used to apply to shared hosting providers, and those entities are now called multi-tenant service providers with a definition that makes sense, and it applies to cloud providers as well. And then there's new requirements for multi-tenant service providers to support or provide evidence to customers for that penetration test that everybody is required to have. So, talking about the flexibility for the different methodologies. So the traditional way, if you fill out your ROC or you had to fill out an SAQ, that's what we're calling the defined approach. That's the same way that you've always done things. The customized approach is what is new. So that focuses on the entity being able to determine the controls that are used to meet the stated objective. And this is not a compensating control, which we'll talk about that on the next slide and how these things are different. But the entity's role with a customized approach is being able to perform a risk analysis, address the risk, define and document those controls, and then perform their own testing to verify the control is working. And you'll have to work with your assessor on this as well. But because customized implementations, everyone is different. There's no defined testing procedures. And this is where working with your assessor is going to be really, really important, and understanding and making sure that you come up with a really good testing procedure. They'll be required to evaluate the entity's customized approach documentation and develop those testing procedures that are appropriate to whatever that specific implementation is. So, and then performing those tests to validate that those controls meet the stated intent, which is what typically happens anyway in the stated testing procedures, which are for the defined approach. So most often, new technologies don't often fit with that traditional method for implementing and validating PCI DSS. And we were constantly getting asked, how do we do this and how does this work? And we don't have a compensating control. We have something that's even better, and it meets it. So it takes a lot more effort than the defined approach. And it's best suited for those more risk mature entities with robust security processes. So who can use this customized approach? So any entity that uses the report on compliance, who has to fill out a ROC, calls in an actual QSA, anyone who fills out an SAQ, which may be most of our audience, they're not eligible for the customized approach. It just doesn't make sense. It's a lot of extra overhead, a lot of extra work, and it doesn't make sense in that way. So I said a little bit about compensating controls versus the customized approach, because we've gotten questions about that, and a lot of people may be very familiar with compensating controls, and there's still an option for those who are using the defined approach, or what I call in my head the traditional approach. But compensating controls are for those entities that can't meet a requirement due to either a business or a technical constraint. And entities often implement an alternative control that simply mitigates that same risk, but there's most likely some other underlying non-compliant system or process in place that just can't be addressed. And that's when a compensating control comes into play. Now, one thing to think about is that often the customized approach objective wouldn't be able to be met either. So that's a good difference there. And then for the customized approach, that's where the entities haven't, like I said, an innovative approach to meet the objective of the requirement in a different way. They chose to implement a different control that will meet that objective, but the control may not meet the specifics in the PCI DSS requirement itself, and that requires the entity to have that strong risk management process in place, be risk mature, and document exactly how that approach meets the requirements objectives. And so compensating controls, those appendices are still in the standard along with the guidance and the template, and they've been updated as well. So if there's clarification in there that they can't be used to retroactively address a requirement that was missed in the past, and that was a question that came up. That was always feedback that we had. For example, where a task that should have been performed, it wasn't performed, and then no action was taken to address it at the time that the assessor was there doing that assessment. And again, for the customized approach, appendices D and E in the standard provide more details on how to complete that. There's a control matrix and risk analysis. So the best part, what do we need to do in order to implement PCI DSS 4.0? So whether you are using the defined approach or the customized approach, working with your assessor is going to be key to a successful assessment. Now, if you fill out an SAQ, working with your acquirer payment processor or your managed service provider or your petroleum brand now is also a really good way to ensure that smooth transition to PCI DSS 4.0. So one of the questions that we have gotten asked is my QSA qualified to perform a PCI DSS 4.0 assessment? So what we're going to do is, for anybody who uses any entities that use a QSA, you'll want to know that. Or if their company, the QSA company, has any qualified QSAs on staff to be able to do that. So maybe your particular QSA hasn't yet gotten the transition training and passed the exam. So once a QSA, and they're required to take a transition training that will be released next month, and pass the exam for that. Once that has happened, then their listing on our website will be updated to indicate that they are now PCI DSS version 4.x certified. So you'll see that same information on the company listing, that they have DSS 4 qualified QSAs. So what can merchants do to improve their readiness for PCI DSS 4.0 assessment or completing that new SAQ? And when I say new, it's just updated. It might be a brand new SAQ for you as well. So contact your QSA. Start planning now. If you complete an SAQ, read that new SAQ. Updates have been made, so understand if there are any new requirements or changes that your organization might need to meet the eligibility of that existing SAQ. Get in touch with your acquirer and processor, or the petroleum brand, and begin those conversations now for any changes that might be needed for your fuel islands or inside the store to your EPS or your POS system, because 2 years, which is when PCI DSS 4 will become the active standard on March 31st, 2024. 2 years is not as much time as you think. How quickly did the last 2 years pass? So doing the planning and analysis now provide you with what you need to work on. So whether that is you're going to have to implement multi-factor authentication or the new password requirements, those have been updated. Waiting until the last minute could inflate timelines, budgets, resource needs, etc. And then that brings me to the consideration of things that might require capital expenditures, bigger budgets. You might need a budget cycle or two to be able to get those things approved and in place. So starting now is definitely the way to go. And then we've got future dated requirements. So those future dated requirements do not become effective until March 31st, 2020. Now, again, the standard itself becomes effective March 31st, 2024, and then there's another year for those future dated requirements before they become effective. But we do also have some new requirements that are effective with PCI DSS 4 in that first assessment. So you want to consider them now and figure out what those individual impacts are to your organization. Performing some sort of gap analysis for those most impactful changes. Is it the passwords? Is it going to be multi-factor authentication? Is it going to be something you've got to take a look at if you have an e-commerce channel? Identifying like a systematic way of approaching those updated requirements will help you plan for that project. And merchants may need to more closely review their requirements with third parties such as acquirers or MNSPs or their payment processors. Requirement 12.8 specifically, whether you complete a self-assessment questionnaire or you have a QSA come in to fill out the ROC, means you're going to be required to maintain a list of the third-party service providers. Ensure you're aware of what requirements you are responsible for, what requirements they're going to be responsible for, and then establishing a program to be able monitor their PCI DSS compliance status annually. And then make sure you've got buy-in from the top down for any of those changes that might need to be made, because they may impact various teams, they may increase workloads in unpredictable ways. And then for those single owner franchisees, you may need to make adjustments to your process and procedures for your store. It may be as simple as that, but that still takes time and it still takes planning, and you want to be prepared for that. So one of the other things too that I could recommend is taking a look at what you do now for your version 3.1, 3.2.1, what that posture looks like for you now, and then compare that to what that might look like under version 4.0, because that's part of that gap analysis. What are you doing now, and what new things or what changes are going to be needed for PCI DSS 4.0? And for some organizations, there may be some really big projects that they have to do, and you want to get them planned, you want to get them started, whether that's, inventories and reviews of cryptographic protocols that are in use, all the hardware and software in use, preventing and detecting phishing, training new users, etc. But for then some of those organizations that are already doing your multi-factor authentication, for example, there may not be a lot of new things to implement. So let's start now. Talk to your processors, talk to your assessors, talk to your acquirer, talk to those petroleum brands, talk to others with similar establishment and payment acceptance channels like your colleagues with Conexxus. But start that planning, start those conversations, and start that review now. So we also have some additional education resources that you may find very useful. So on our website, you can find a list of approved QSAs if you need one. You also have access to the document library where all of the different documents you're going to need have been published. The newsroom, you can subscribe to our blog, see all the different posts and all the latest news. And then that FAQ section is where you're going to find answers to a lot of your questions. So I highly recommend going and taking a look at our website and familiarizing yourself with those areas. Now, the other thing that we're really excited about that we implemented with PCI DSS 4.0 is the PCI DSS 4.0 Resource Hub. This is a single spot. It lives on our blog. It has links to both the standards documents and all the supporting documents and educational resources in one place. So if you bookmark that page, it's updated frequently. It was even updated as late as yesterday with additional information. You'll find the video First Look at PCI DSS, where several of my colleagues got together and talked about DSS 4.0 and what that means. There is an infographic, what's new with PCI DSS 4.0, an at-a-glance document, so you can see exactly what changed. Links to the standards in the validation documents in the document library, so you don't have to go directly to the document library and then search for that. You can go there, click it, and it takes you directly to the link. And then we have links to our new podcast, Coffee with the Council. And the latest two that we have out there are with Candace Young and Tom White, who talk about the training and the DSS and all the information that was released. And then myself and Lindsay Goodspeed talk about all the resources and the events that are coming up, which I'll tell you about in just a moment. And we just released a couple of other podcasts on that as well. Like I said, we're also releasing PCI DSS 4.0 in translated into several different languages. So if English isn't your primary language, you need it in Spanish or Portuguese, Japanese, those languages are going to be out there. So how else can you get involved, and what can you, where can you go to learn more? So we're excited about the community events and programs that we're putting on for 2022 around PCI DSS 4. So the first one's coming up in June. It opens on June 21st. It is our PCI DSS 4.0 Global Symposium, and it is about 3 hours worth of content that is open to eligible stakeholders. I'll talk more about that in just a second. And we're very excited about the fact that we're going to be back in person with our community meetings. So the first one will be in September in Toronto, Ontario, Canada, and our Europe community meeting will be in October in Milan, Italy. Registration for both of those will be opening very soon. And then at the end of the year, we're going to be launching our global content library. So if you're unable to attend the global symposium or the community meetings, that content is going to be available in that library for folks to be able to view. So I was talking about our global symposium. Like I said, there's 3 hours worth of content. You will get CPEs if that's something that interests you. Registration is open now. It's open to eligible stakeholders. That is QSAs, ISAs, all of our participating organizations, any of our ASVs or PFIs. It is free, it is on demand, and it will be available until August 30th as we shut that down just prior to our community meeting. So if you haven't registered, definitely go register for that. And then if you aren't a participating organization, you can definitely join us. You get 2 free tickets to those community meetings. You also get the opportunity, and I like to say privilege as well, to be able to participate in those requests for comments that we do for all of our standards. So you can review and comment and help shape those standards just like those other organizations did over the last 4 years. And each year you get 2 free PCI awareness training tickets. That's an online CBT course that you can send any of your staff through. It is a really interesting training. You can stand for election on a board of advisors that help advise us and guide us and keep us up to date on what's happening in the industry. You get a weekly monitor newsletter. You can also participate in our special interest groups. The special interest group from 2021, which has wrapped up and will be published very soon, was on container orchestration. We've had some on penetration testing, third-party security assurance, e-commerce, multiple others. And it's just a way to be able to make that difference, securing payment data globally. So we hope to have you join us. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Don.
Thanks, Elizabeth. I mean, that's a lot of great information on this update. A lot of information packed into a shorter period of time. I'm sure you could probably go on for hours about this. I know it sparked some questions in my mind, but we're going to open it up to the group and move into our Q&A section of this webinar now. So. Elizabeth, we're in the Q&A section of our webinar, and again, I'll say a lot of great information that you've given us in the last 30 minutes. Hopefully it sparked some questions for those of you out in the audience. But before I do, I want to remind everyone that Elizabeth cannot answer specific compliance questions, and that participants should talk with their assessor or petroleum brand for guidance. So just keep that in mind as you're kind of posing some of these questions that you may have. Questions are starting to roll in. Got a few out there. Please keep putting them into the question section, and I'll try to get to them. But I'm going to kick one off for you here. One that came to my mind as I was listening to your updates, and so. You know, given a majority of our merchants in our industry may not use an assessor, how much do these updates with version 4.0 really affect the typical cstore or petroleum merchant?
That's really a great question, because specific updates are really going to depend on which SAQ the merchant completes or previously completed, and that's going to be based on their particular environment. So some of the general updates for self-assessing merchants, which again is likely the majority, and I mentioned this, look out for those policies and procedure requirements. We know you're already doing them, and a lot of them may be just general process, but they need to be documented now, formally documented, regularly updated, as we always hear, and make sure that anybody who is working in the store understands them. Anybody who might be affected by that understands them. And this is where some like internal training. So when you're onboarding someone to come in, make sure they understand. For example, we added policy and procedure to requirement 3 for protection of stored cardholder data, and requirement 5 for malware protection. So if those requirements are in your SAQ and you're required to do that, then you're going to have some policies and procedures. And you'll see that scattered through, and it was almost intentional that we added the requirement because it was kind of understood, but not in the requirement that these things needed to be done. So we just made sure to add all of those. And then we talked a little bit about those future dated requirements. And future dated requirements take place the 31st of March, 2025. So that's 3 years from now, roughly. So some of the things that might become effective for folks will be targeted risk analyses for requirements that offer flexibility in those periodic activities. Remember, I mentioned there's the definition of what periodic is and the different types of things. So for those particular requirements that have those periodic activities, there's some flexibility with that. So for example, requirement 5 includes that targeted risk analysis requirement for how often you evaluate those system components identified as not at risk for malware, and how often to perform those malware scans. I know for the longest time, Apple products, I'll just throw that out there, not endorsing anything, but Apple products were considered a little more secure than, say, you know, some other products that are out there. But you want to make sure that those are defined and understand, you know, how often those need to be evaluated. Requirement 12.3.1 lists all the elements of what a targeted risk analysis must include to be appropriate for whatever that period is. So I know we get asked that, like, what needs to be included in that, because if you're a small, you know, single store franchisee, you may not necessarily have any idea what a risk analysis is. But if you're a more mature organization or a larger organization, you're going to have some sort of risk methodology that you're using for things. But 12.3.1 defines what those elements are. And so it's pretty straightforward there. One other thing that I wanted to mention, because this might impact people, and I know I'm thinking in my head on a personal level how this may impact me, is authentication. So passwords and passphrases used as authentication factors, because we talk about multi-factor authentication. It's something you have, something you know, something you are, those types of things. The increase for the minimum length of that is increasing to 12 characters. So we get stuck sometimes with passwords because, you know, they're difficult. We have 9,000 of them that we have to remember on a daily basis. But for things that are relative to PCI DSS and complying with that, is that minimum length is going to increase in about 3 years. So another thing is addressing the evolving threats in the industry. So anti-phishing, social engineering tactics have been addressed in requirements 5 and 12. And so everybody's seen that crazy email that comes through that says, hey, I saw that you made a payment. I get them all the time. I think PayPal, I get weird PayPal emails that say, you've changed your password. Can you please confirm? And I'm like, no, I didn't. So there's phishing situations there. It's just a different type of social engineering tactic. And one of the other things for these single store franchisees or smaller franchisees and merchants is understanding what social engineering tactics might be used. So, you know, if somebody comes in or calls up and says, hey, I'm with so-and-so and I want to be able to log into your system, have a list of people that you know are working in, you know, on your EPS or POS system, or people that come to update the fuel islands, etc. So just knowing what some of those tactics are, and then controls to prevent skimming attacks. So skimming attacks have become more frequent. And those are laid out in requirements 6 and 11. So that's whether or not that's an overlay on a terminal. I don't know how many of you have seen, but you could go out and search this on the interwebs, where someone comes into a convenience store. It's two people. One of them has a couple of bags of chips and they hold it in front of the POS device on the counter. Someone else comes by and asks for something behind the counter, distracts the clerk, and in like 2 seconds, they throw an overlay onto that terminal. So it's just little things like that. But rest assured, we are working to update a lot of the supporting materials for PCI DSS 4, and I know that folks rely on this very heavily. And one thing I wanted to mention, any of the documents that we mentioned that are on our website or any of the information, it's all free to access, download, etc. There's no charge for any of that, and there's a lot of really great info out there. So we are working to update the SAQ instruction and guidelines document, which is going to be super helpful for anybody filling it out. And so depending on which SAQ you have to use, you're going to have your guidelines and your instructions for filling that out. And right now, the estimate for that to be released is the 3rd quarter. So we'll keep everybody updated on that. And then we're looking to develop more supporting materials for those self-assessing entities. It might be delivered in the form of our blog posts, different articles, collaboration with different organizations like Conexxus, as well as, you know, other types of things that we'll put out on our website. So if you haven't already subscribed to our blog, definitely do that, because that, like I said, that thing gets updated at least on a weekly basis, sometimes twice a week with different information. So sign up for those notifications for any of that new material. The PCI DSS 4.0 Resource Hub, any of the documentation that gets released, whether it's a separate blog post, a separate entry, it's going to be on that page. And so you can go directly there. And then I mentioned the Global Symposium. So that's coming up in like, what, 3 weeks? It's gotten here really fast. So that's going to be available. It is free to attend. It's completely online. It's about 3 hours worth of content. We do a really deep dive into the different requirements, the reporting aspects. And if most of the folks that are members with Conexxus are participating organizations, or if you are an ISA within your company, you can join that for free. Registration is currently open, so we highly recommend that. And then a lot of the materials that we present in the Global Symposium will also be at those community meetings. So if my understanding is registration should be opening today, but very soon. So check our events page on that and sign up for the community meeting. It's going to be a lot of great material. We're going to be super excited. We're going to have very specific tracks that are on PCI DSS on each of the days. So you will learn a lot of things. We're going to have office hours. Folks can come ask us questions. The training team is also going to have a dedicated room, which is something we've not done in the past. So if there are some really specific questions that you have, and they're going to have a whiteboard and they can map it all out and help you kind of figure out where things are and how things might work, that's going to be available as well as, plenty of networking opportunities to talk with other folks in your industry, outside of your industry, and garner some information there. So stay tuned for that.
Cool, great. A lot of things from that one question. So
Yeah.
So I do have a couple that came in, and so I'm going to kind of jump into one of the first ones, and it's revolving around the PCI DSS responsibilities matrix, and the question is really more about is the matrix now required for all third-party service providers, and kind of to add on to it. I think because it goes in line with it is, if so, do they need to all be combined into one master matrix document?
Okay, so the short answer is no, it's not required. However, requirement 12.8 and 12.9, which talk about your responsibilities with those third-party service providers, so your MNSPs, whoever that might be, your EPS POS system providers, there are sub-requirements for information and responsibility sharing between you, the merchant, and the service provider. And the completion of the responsibilities matrix is not required, but it's really good practice. And in the document that you all published, the PCI compliance responsibilities for convenience and retail fuel industry, was a mouthful. You all mentioned that particular responsibilities matrix from that third-party service provider security assurance SIG document, and that is something really good to be able to put together and use. And if you haven't read that document, it is a bit lengthy, but it goes into a lot of really good detail about how to have those conversations with that third party and determine who's responsible for what, because you really want to know at the end of the day what you are responsible for and what that third party is going to be responsible for, because ultimately you need to know if they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. But no, it's not required. It is really good practice, and if it makes sense to have a consolidated document, because there's a lot of requirements, if it makes sense to have a consolidated document, master document for all the different providers, or if it makes sense to have separate documents, that would be completely up to the entity. And again, it's a great document to take a look at, and it's really good to have.
So it sounds like good guidance, good practice, good way to start, but it's not a requirement necessarily.
Correct. Absolutely.
So you talked about knowing who your third parties, what they're doing, everything, kind of on a little bit on that, because when we're talking about vendors. So another question that came in says, I'm predicting the vendor fight over what connected to components are and are not in scope. Whose assessor is ultimately wins that battle? And the hopes are that it's hopefully not the one that's being paid off. So I don't know. It's a little bit there, maybe a little in depth. Or towards compliance. But do you have any feedback or thoughts on that you can provide?
Yeah, and we, just to be fair to everyone, we do get asked this quite a lot. So 12.5.2 in PCI DSS 4 is a requirement for scope documentation to be done by the entity. It's different than what the assessor is required to do during the assessment. The entity defines it and the assessor validates it. So this does put more of the impetus back on the entity to really understand the scope. And we know that it's a big deal. So you define it, and you are able, if you've got a justification, a business justification, etc., you define it as the entity, and then the assessor's responsibility is simply to assess against that. We also added some bits into the scoping section of PCI DSS. That's part of the preambles, because we did get asked this question quite a lot. And so we expanded that. There's some really good information that's in that section. So it does help to help people with that, because we give examples. That's what I'm trying to get at. We give examples of Inscope system components to try to help clarify that. So hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, I think it, I mean, again, it's all about the guidance, right? I mean, I understand sometimes it's difficult to give specifics on this. We're not paying you to tell us what the answers are. We're just here to have the guidance on it. So
I can answer it the way most assessors or auditors I've ever had to be involved with it depends. Which is not the answer that you want, but that is definitely the answer. So hopefully that, like I said, the expansion of the scope section, as well as the additional information that we have in that was 1252, that helps. And if there are other questions that come up and concerns, you can definitely reach out and send questions to info@PCISecurityStandards.org, or there's a form on our website. You can go put that there. And we're looking around to see if there's any specific FAQs that might help with that as well.
Okay, cool. Still just looking at some other ones that are coming in. I'm gonna jump over to one other one that I had real quick. And it really is around, I know you talked a little bit about PADSS and how it's being retired. How does the council see it affecting our POS developers and, software release cycles that are coming out? And then I do have kind of a follow-up one that goes on security architecture that may feed into that a little bit too. So
okay.
From security.
So yeah, and this is a great question, because like I said, PCI DSS is the first standard that we've ever retired, and that's coming up in October. So we have a plethora of PCI DSS validated applications, and a ton of those are for fuel islands and EPS and POS systems, et cetera. So the biggest change that I see, and this needs to be very carefully understood, is that all currently deployed, listed, validated payment applications that are on the acceptable for new deployments list on October 28th will be moved to the acceptable for pre-existing deployment only. And so this means that the vendor may continue to support those applications that are already in the field, that are already deployed. However, no new deployments of that listed application would be allowed. That's in a nutshell, that's kind of what that means. So whether the organization has a PCI DSS validated application, and whether they will need to move that over to our software security framework, or the application can be supported in place as it is going to be predicated on whether or not the payment brands or the acquirers deems the use of it acceptable. At this time, we haven't heard of any formal decisions, at least at the payment brand level, on whether or not that would continue. But we do encourage everyone to reach out to the payment brands, reach out to their acquirer to see, how they may be impacted. And then, one of the other things, and this will be a shameless plug for SSF, but until then, for anybody who is currently a POS payment software vendor, and you'd like to have your software, whether that's the existing application that may need some updates, or a new payment software, to be able to have that software listed for new deployments beyond October 28, then the software security framework is the way to go. And the key things that we focused on were facilitating security by design, which is a really big thing, as well as always protecting payment data, but mitigating threats and minimizing vulnerabilities, and enabling the software to defend itself from attacks. So the secure software standard, there's two standards in that framework: secure software standard and secure SLC standard. So secure software is for validated payment software that will be listed, and it has security capabilities that payment software must possess. So then Secure SLC validates secure development capabilities that the payment software vendors themselves must possess. And so using them together, it allows flexibility within the organization, within that development process, because we know things are being developed at a much more rapid pace. And so this helps because it specifically helps if the vendor has had their SDLC evaluated, qualified, and listed, because it allows them some flexibility when they need to make updates to their software. Some of the flexibility is that depending on the software change, they can make that update without having to call in the assessor again to reevaluate the software, which was one of the larger complaints with PCI DSS is every change required you to call in the assessor. And so if your SDLC processes have been validated and you're listed, and then you've got a software application that was developed using that qualified SDLC, then you've got some flexibility there. And so that way you can develop more rapidly, get those changes out into the industry. And then if anybody's interested, we offer informational training, and I push this for our software vendors because I think it's going to be incredibly useful. We offer what we call informational training, which is basically just auditing any of the SSF training classes for assessors. So you're sitting in class, learning along with the assessors, and you're going to learn exactly what the assessor is going to come in and evaluate your software or your SDLC practices against. So there's no exam, just want to say that there's no exam for that, and no prerequisites. It's just if there's space in the class, you register, pay the registration fee, and then you can attend in person, or you can attend our e-learning online both with live trainers, so you can ask questions, and any information on that can be found on our website. So.
Okay. So the kind of a tag along here, and by the way, we're running close on time, so if you have some questions, please get them in right away, and we'll try to get them fed. I got two more here that I think, you know, but back to on the realm of our PCI DSS and software. You know, the question, and I'm going to kind of component or change it a little bit, but is there going to be guidance on how to create a software architecture more to allow, because we have so much interchange, right? Mm-hmm. And interchange, it's not just the point of sale, it's all these other systems that are coming in, and maybe some guidance on the software architecture. Because in many cases where these components either become either temporary or permanently compromised, you know, having some of that just guidance on it, as to say, when we're having this data exchange, it's not just about one point of sale, right? It's about all these other systems.
Yeah.
So that's kind of more where that question, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
So we are looking at that, and our software security working group is looking at that as well. And so as it relates to interconnectivity and PCI DSS compliance overall, so there's some additional guidance that's going to be coming out for that. So again, make sure you sign up on our website for those updates. And then we're going to be looking at all of our information supplements and the opportunities to create a new one. So from that perspective, we are creating guidance. I will say this, if this is, and I believe it is, because I can see some of the questions from some of the folks that sat on the Petrol Task Force with me, we talked about this a lot, is we will have a special interest group submission process coming up around the community meeting times, or in a couple of months. So if this is a topic that you would like additional guidance on from the industry, absolutely, anybody can submit that, and maybe you all get together and submit it. And then, you know, that's something that we can do. And if it isn't something that a special interest group can do, then, you know, maybe that's something we take back to the task force and say, hey, can we develop this guidance? Because it is, I understand you've got your fuel islands, the EPS POS system, you've got your potentially MNSP, and depending on whether or not you have an additional acquirer, and then you might have your loyalty programs plugged into that, and then you got your back office systems and tank monitoring systems and all the things that are all connected together. So yeah, if there is an opportunity and something very specific, we absolutely want to collaborate on that and make sure we're getting the appropriate guidance out.
I think we always joke, and everybody in every industry says, oh, we're so difficult. But I think you even mentioned that our industry is pretty difficult because it's that spider web of everything, right? I mean, it's not just a point of sale and a pin pad and everything. There's 20 other million components that we deal with. So, no, that's great. Hopefully we'll get some good feedback and some questions in on that. So, we're right at the top of the hour. I know there's one more question that came in. I don't know if hopefully we can have time, maybe leave it on this one, but because there was a question that I think actually I saw with a point of sale vendor yesterday, and some acquirers are talking about the difference between existing use and new use with locations. And it gets tricky, right? Because I have all this equipment, but sometimes a piece of it breaks and I can't just change this one little piece. And I know this may be getting very specific, but in a broad sense, is there any other guidance maybe that you can provide around what's existing versus new when we talk? Is it specific to a specific location, or if like, hey, I got to replace this specific pin pad, is that considered new, or is it because we had that other pin pad in there before that we can just replace it? Or am I getting too specific here?
It is specific, but generally speaking, my understanding, and I will go back and validate this, my understanding is it would be a new merchant, like
Okay.
net new is my understanding. And what I'll do also is we'll take that information back to the software working group, because they're working on some additional FAQs and different guidance, as well as updates to that standard, and make sure that there's clarification on what that means, as well as the information that we will be putting out as well and sending to vendors specifically around the retirement of PA DSS, because it's important to understand what that means in context, because you don't want folks getting tripped up because the pin pad blew, you got to replace it, or something else happened, but it's an existing merchant.
Yeah, and it's definitely a question that comes up quite a bit, so some better guidance would be great on that. So
okay,
well, great. Well, I really appreciate your time. This has been a lot of fun today. It's been fun getting to learn more, and I know there's going to be more and more questions that continue, and I know you supplied some outlets for us to continue asking them. So but with that, I guess I'll turn it back over to Donna here, and we'll wrap this up.
Right. Thank you guys so much. Elizabeth, Don, thank you so much for hanging out with us for so long today, and for sharing all your knowledge and wisdom and experience with us. And I hope that we can do it again soon. Thank you so much. Everyone, enjoy the rest of your day.
Bye, all.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks.